Thomas a.lbos is quietly pioneering the harmony of Blender and Houdini. Many of these pieces throw the equilibrium into disarray, and we watch these kind of little dramas play out from the resulting energies. I'm just describing these satisfying simulations that, far from being chaotic, are framed with thoughtful motion design and flow. a.lbos has worked alongside Sidemen, Shopify and Nike, and is now sharing with us 3D specialist experience. So I'll definitely be leaving my favourite takeaway in the comments below, where I'll invite you to tell us what you found most interesting. So take a listen. Okay, hey, thanks so much for your time. I'll just jump straight into the questions. So first off, how did you begin? How did you get interested in 3D, specifically these simulations?
So I originally got into 3D because as a kid, I was always kind of interested in visual effects. I briefly remember downloading a cracked version of Adobe After Effects somewhere around 2010. After that, I went down the rabbit hole of messing with the Element 3D plugin and then the light version of Cinema 4D that came with After Effects. But I remember feeling quite limited with those tools. At the time, you really couldn't do much with Cinema 4D. So I eventually found myself downloading Blender because at this point, it was probably around 2012, 2013, right when Cycles Render was released with Blender. So with Cycles now, I was capable of making realistic looking images in Blender, and that's when I started getting into 3D. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, I was now fairly comfortable in Blender. Keep in mind, learning Blender at that time was not as easy as it is today. Today, you have millions of tutorials on YouTube showing you how to do everything. But back then, the Blender community was really small. The only person making any useful tutorials was Andrew Price. So it did take me a good 3-4 years to get used to Blender. But anyway, at this point in my life, I was now at university and I wasn't studying 3D or design or anything like that. But I did meet this guy who also did a bit of 3D, except he was using Autodesk Maya. And I remember him telling me that Maya was really complicated and old and not fun to use. So I said, okay, why don't you learn Blender? And he just wasn't interested in Blender because he thought it was a very basic software, which wasn't uncommon. I think at the time, a lot of people felt like that about Blender because it was free. So I said, okay, why don't you learn Cinema 4D? And he said, all right, I'll learn Cinema 4D if you learn Cinema 4D with me. So I was like, all right. We downloaded a cracked version of Cinema 4D and we started learning, but we both sort of hit a wall pretty soon because this guy was really interested in creating kind of abstract simulations with particles and smoke and fluids and stuff like that. The kind of stuff we'd see people creating on Instagram with Cinema 4D. But what we didn't realize is that Cinema 4D actually didn't come with any simulation tools. There was no smoke simulation system, no fluids, no particle system. Well, the particle system was really basic, so it wasn't much you can do with it. And that's when I realized we would need to get plugins like X Particles and RealFlow and Turbulence FD. And we'd have to pay for GPU render engines like Octane and Redshift because Cinema 4D didn't even come with that. But being students at university, we didn't exactly have money to throw at plugins like that. So at this point, out of frustration, I decided to go back to Blender and start doing all these simulation type things just using Blender. So I started learning all sorts of smoke sims and fluid sims and particles. But not long after that, the Blender developers decided to get rid of the smoke simulation system and replace it with a new system called MantaFlow, which was a massive downgrade. I still don't understand why they did that because the old smoke simulation system was actually really good. People were doing crazy things with Blender back then. But ever since then, ever since they replaced it with MantaFlow, a lot of that stuff became impossible. So that's when I decided to start learning Houdini, which is a software primarily built for simulations, things like smoke and fluids and particles. So that's where my interest in simulations came from. It came from that friendship with that guy at university and trying to learn how to do the same kind of stuff that he was interested in.
I understood that you've worked alongside some big names like Shopify, Nike, Sidemen. So would you tell us a little bit about the story behind that? How you managed to secure those types of clients and how it felt to work alongside them?
Yeah, for Shopify and Sidemen, I believe they just found me through Instagram. That was kind of my goal with Instagram. I remember starting my page thinking, I'm going to fake it till I make it, just make a profile every day, try my best to make a render or an animation of some sort, something that would look nice on my portfolio, until I eventually get noticed by some bigger brands or studios that would perhaps offer me work. So within the first 6 months of starting my page, I think I went up to about 3,000 followers, which was way more than I had even hoped for. And that's when I got contacted by Shopify to work on a project with them as a freelancer. That's how I got into freelance work. And it was the same thing with Sidemen. One of their designers found me through Instagram and contacted me by email. For Nike, it was slightly different as I worked on the project through a studio called Not Important Studio. So Not Important Studio is a studio run by pretty much one guy who I met online on Discord a few years back, and he's been a freelance photographer for many years previous, so he already has a huge portfolio of stunning work of all sorts of big brands and clients who he slowly started pushing towards, 3D marketing and stuff. So he started getting into doing more and more 3D work, and he and I would often work together. I would not be where I am today without him. A lot of my freelance projects and clients came through him, and over the years we've grown incredibly close. We're very good friends, and I owe everything to him for how much he's helped me grow as an artist and how much he's taught me about the business side of things and being a sole trader. So the Nike project was thanks to him, and we worked together on that. I worked mostly on the technical side of things, modeling and simulations, but the rest of the project was handled by Not Important Studio. Yeah, working for Shopify and Sidemen and Nike was great. Of course, for Shopify, I worked directly with their design team, and they were a lovely bunch of people, really organized, really kind. They really were the dream client for someone just starting freelance. They set an example of what a good client looks like, which was very useful, for someone just starting off freelance. For Sidemen, I really only reported to their lead designer, so it was very streamlined. And with Nike, I just reported to Not Important Studio, so I was away from the front lines for those projects.
Could you share with us where and how you find inspiration or motivation for your ideas? And a related question to that is, how do you then decide which idea you want to try to commit to developing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm the most creative person when it comes to 3D. I usually struggle with coming up with ideas. I find myself feeling most creative when I learn something new, because to learn something new in 3D, you have to learn all the basic techniques that lead up to creating the final thing it is you're trying to learn. So when I learn something new, I learn these basic techniques, and it's often during this stage that I get distracted with all these new techniques and I go off on a tangent and start creating new things. So whenever I'm feeling like I'm stuck, I decide to either learn something new, learn a new software, or learn a new form of simulation. I once heard someone say, in 3D, the day you stop learning is the day you fall behind, because in the 3D industry, everyone's kind of racing each other to find the new best techniques or ideas. So you have to learn new things all the time, not just to stay up to date with software and tools, but to spawn and develop new ideas as well.
Could you tell us the stories behind these two pieces, the psychedelic fungal growth simulation and the melting cosmos piece?
So I'm actually glad you asked about the fungal growth effect with the Instagram logo, because it means I get to introduce you to one of the coolest things ever made in 3D. A few years ago, before I started learning Houdini, I remember scrolling through Instagram and seeing a video from a studio called Panoply, and this video was called Tide. And it was the most mesmerizing thing I've ever seen. I remember just staring at it for 30 minutes straight. I could not figure out what it was that I was looking at and how it was done. And when I looked into the caption and saw the hashtag, Houdini, that's when I actually decided, okay, I'm going to learn Houdini. As time went by, I kept watching that video. I eventually realized it was a 2D smoke simulation that was projected onto a 2D plane, but I still couldn't figure out how they got the smoke to move in that mesmerizing way. So years later, I'm still trying to figure out how they did that in Houdini. Eventually, I see a new post on Instagram by a guy named Kimco, who managed to somehow recreate almost exactly the same effect from the video from Panoply. So I reached out to him and asked how he got that effect, and he pretty much just gave me the answer that I needed, which was use a drag force. So I tried setting up a similar scene in Houdini and dropped in a drag force, and it's the drag force that makes the smoke move almost like a liquid. So then I tried coming up with fun new ways I could display the effect, and at the time I was watching The Last of Us on HBO. So I thought, why not use it to try and create like a fungus growth using the Instagram logo. The melting cosmos effect is actually really simple and quite boring actually when you realize what it was supposed to be. So initially what I was trying to do here was I wanted to simulate lava flowing down a hill. So I created a hill using a program called Gaia, which allows you to simulate all sorts of natural erosion on a sloped surface. I then brought that into Houdini and dropped a big pool of viscous fluid on the top of the hill and let it flow down. As I started trying to figure out how I was going to shade and light the scene, I settled on the idea of just rendering the fluid particles as they were, so just as particles, and coloring them based on the speed. So particles that move very fast would have a different color from particles that are moving really slow. So I used one of the default ramp presets in Houdini to get this distribution of colors mapped on the speed, and that's what I ended up with, yeah. So it actually had nothing to do with the melting cosmos. That's just what I called it after a friend of mine said, hey, it kind of looks like a galaxy melting and breaking apart.
Have you got anything you're working on at the moment that we could have a behind-the-scenes preview of?
I don't really have anything big going on at the moment. Most of my personal projects are small things that I do in an hour or two whenever I have a spare second. A couple of days ago, I posted my latest personal project on Instagram, which was this weird kind of blue magic smoky teardrop thing. I don't really have a name for it, but it was quite simple to do. It's just a smoke simulation that drops down and collides with a surface. I simulated the smoke in Houdini, of course, using the Axiom Solver, which is a plugin for Houdini that allows you to simulate smoke on your GPU. So it's very fast. It runs pretty much in real time, which makes it very easy to art direct the smoke. I added viscosity to the smoke, which helps keep the smoke quite wispy and fluid-like. I then exported the smoke simulation to Blender to render with cycles, because cycles is incredibly flexible, especially when it comes to shading volumetrics and messing around with attributes and stuff like that.
And my favourite question is, what number one bit of advice would you give your younger self?
Honestly, if I could go back and give my younger self some advice, I'd probably just tell myself to go outside and touch the grass. I feel like I've made a lot of the right choices when it comes to 3D and learning to become a 3D artist, so I don't really have any advice in that regard. But when I was younger, I was very active. I used to do a lot of sports and a lot of gym, and I still try my best to be active these days. You know, physically I'm still fit and healthy, but I think spending 8 hours a day, every day in front of the computer, trying to solve problems for things that don't even exist in the real world can have an impact on your mind, especially in the long run. And I'm not talking like depression, I just mean like going crazy. You know, when I follow the same routine every day and I sit at my computer all day to do 3D and develop new ideas and learn new things, I just start talking to myself too much and stuff like that. So yeah, just to focus on your body and your mind, speak to people, go on a run, go on a bike. Just make sure to incorporate some sort of movement in your daily routine, aside from just sitting in a chair.
But the most important question is, how and where can people support you?
Honestly, if you want to support me, the only thing I can ask is that you follow my work on Instagram. Just that on its own is enough. Whenever someone comments on my work, I still always get butterflies, and I usually always reply. I'm thankful for everything already. I feel like I don't deserve a lot of the attention that I've received as an artist, so I can't really ask for any more. But if you're really interested, I am thinking of starting a Patreon soon where I'll share some tips and tricks on how I learned Houdini as a Blender user. I know there are many Blender users who want to start learning Houdini to make use of its powerful simulation tools, who are just afraid to get into it. So I'm thinking starting a Patreon to share everything about how I managed to get comfortable with Houdini as a Blender user. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thanks a lot for your time and for your interest in that.
It's encouraging, isn't it, to hear, but also to see that hard work does pay off. There's so much to take away that it's difficult to choose just one thing. But if I had to, I would say my highlight is don't stop learning. And it's this that's actually motivated me to at least take a look at Houdini. But as a bonus, I really do relate to the touch grass or go crazy sentiment. But what do you think? Tell me in the comments below and I'll see you there.